Introduce myself. I'm Douglas Biow. I'm the director for the Center for European Studies. That's Sally Dixon. She's a senior program coordinator. So if anybody contacts the centers, most likely you'll be talking to her. And Charlotte Harris will, if you get any funding from us, you will undoubtedly be talking or communicating to her. I'm glad so many people came. I gather they're both undergraduates and graduate students, and I even see a faculty member that I know, and maybe more faculty members here as well. We're trying to do this every year and get bigger and bigger, enlarging the scope as we do this. But just to remind you, some of us like to go to Europe, and there's all kinds of ways in which you can get there. After college, I funded myself. That's always a way to go. And I spent about 3.5 years there living because I fell in love with Italy. And so I got a job as a, well, I play the violin on the streets to my daughter's chagrin. I tell them sometimes to make money, but most of the time what I was doing is teaching English as a foreign language. But then when I got serious as a scholar and decided that to be gainfully employed, there were all kinds of ways that I managed to get over there. One was the Javits Fellowship, which is now lamentably has disappeared, which funded me quite a while in graduate school. Another one was the fellowship, which Erica will talk to you about, which is the Fulbright Fellow, which is great for all kinds of places. In my case, it was going back to Italy. And then later on, there are other kinds of things that apply for any ages and things of that sort, which got me over there. And then, you know, when you figure out, really, if there's an individual place that you really want to go, often there will be grants to go to that individual place. If anybody wants to go to Venice, I've got a grant for you. They'll fund you. Just find a half-decent project, I can help you create that project. And then once you go, they'll fund you to do anything related to Venice and any other place outside of Venice for some money. So there are all kinds of ways in which you can think about getting to Europe, apart from the kinds of funding sources that we have at the university itself. And I think it behooves you all the more to think about ways. Now there's one way undergraduates can get over to Europe right through our center, and that is if you're interested in learning a language. I think for undergraduates it can't be French, German, or Spanish, but if you're interested in learning a language in Europe over the summer, we have what are called foreign language, foreign language area studies, thank you, scholarships, which allow you to go there for 6 weeks or more in programs for intensive language study. That's true for graduate students. We also have, they should be on the web right now, if you go to our home page, there are grants for both faculty and graduate students. Unfortunately, we don't have any individual grants for undergraduates, but if you are a CES major, there may be one here, or maybe somebody who decides all of a sudden after hearing me talk that they would like to become one, because we have all kinds of money to send you abroad for 6 weeks on semester and summer programs and things of that sort. All kinds of money. Well, substantial amount of money.
Board?
What's that?
Board? Do you push the board?
We haven't, no. But so I have two people to talk to you about different kinds of opportunities. Many of you will know Larry Carver. Larry Carver has been around UT certainly, well, let me look at the biography here. Okay, longer than I have. And he's the professor of English and the holder of the Doyle Professorship of Western Civilization. He's most known to many of you as the director of Liberal Arts Honors in the program in Humanities here. But also, he is someone who has transformed the way we go about getting students Truman Fellowships, Marshall Fellowships, and Rhodes Scholarships. Before Larry came on board, we had a not terribly illustrious record, and since he's come on board, we've had an extraordinary record of success. And so I think he'll talk to you, among other things, about opportunities, but also the craft of putting together sometimes a program. And Erica Lutes is, and this is remarkable, she is the youngest. And she reminded us, both Larry and I, the two of us Larry and me over lunch, that she is indeed the youngest. Executive director has 60-year history of the Fulbright. She is originally from New Jersey and speaks English and Dutch. She carries 3 business-oriented master's degrees from the University of Leiden. I think what's important, over lunch we were talking about how more and more, and I don't care what program you're in, whether it's engineering or things of this, you need to know how to write grants. And so even if, and finding ways of, how can I put it, since I'm a Renaissance scholar, I'll think in the terms that are most germane to me, know your audience, rhetorically. know who you're writing to, figure out the right kind of grant, and things of this sort. And I think Erica will speak about some of those kinds of things. She has a record, just a commendable record in knowing how to go about doing that and advancing her own career in the process. And she, as I say, she was in New Jersey, went to Wall Street, worked there, and now finds herself in Brussels running a variety of programs connected to Fulbright, and has a very very busy, active life, engaged in bringing people over to Europe and conversely people back to the United States. So I'll leave it to that. I think, Erica, you were going to speak first as the slide is up, and then
Sure.
I think Larry will intervene as he sees fit. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I am feeling so energized to be sitting outside, the sun, you have palm trees on your campus. Frankly speaking, this is like the next thing, like Pepperdine. It's like Malibu, being on the beaches of Malibu overlooking this. It's amazing. I was at Austin City Limits this weekend, so how many of you were there as well?
Woohoo!
Yeah, in fact, you're sitting in this room right now is impressive after those 3 days. But it's actually one of my first times to Texas. I know that New Jersey and Texas have a lot in common. We're often made fun of in international settings. Jersey Shore was really bad for me as a cultural thing. I don't know what you guys have, Housewives of Austin or something. I don't know what you have here. But I've been in Belgium for about 8 years, and so I've started to do these outreach presentations similar to the one we're doing today because I want to kind of drive up interest in applying for not only Fulbright but any kind of scholarship, and second about thinking about international careers and international focus. How many of you are in the bachelor's program here? Just a show of hands. A little more proud, okay. And of those, how many of you are seniors? And how many of you are juniors or younger? Excellent. How many of you are in the graduate program here? Okay, and in a PhD program? Wow. And any faculty that I may have missed? Wow, this is great. Wow, so we have a bit of everything. So I'll try to kind of jump around a little bit. Because I'm standing here together with someone who does a lot of, has a big focus on scholarships and so on, just jump in whenever you like, because I think it's a pretty flexible program. Indeed, I'm the Fulbright director for 2 Fulbright programs, not just one, which is Belgium. So if any of you have questions about coming to this romantic country of Belgium, we have waffles, chocolate, beer, and fries. You can also ask me about those. But the second that I thought would be really interesting to talk about is this Fulbright Schumann grant, which is very, let's say, under-publicized. Not amongst the Europeans. The Europeans know a lot about this grant, but it's the Americans who don't know a lot about it. And the reason is because it's kind of a complicated grant. And I found out that in the scope of scholarships, the more complicated something is, the more easy it is to kind of forget about it. But what's nice about this scholarship for all of you is that because I'm telling you publicly that this is an applied to fund on the American side, that might be a big hint for all of you to apply to it, because we see fewer applications than we'd like to see, certainly fewer well-qualified applications than we'd like to see. One of the things that I thought Douglas was mentioning during lunch, which was so interesting, was talking about following the funding stream. So in other words, and everything that I do, at least in my job at this point, seeing how I'm here on no government funds, I was so delighted that they paid for lunch today because the government, as you know, has shut down. So technically I'm not even supposed to be here. And certainly can't even get a coffee reimbursed at this week. It is so incredible to kind of look at where the money flows from, because that kind of will indicate to you how to present or position yourself. Now, without being superficial and all that kind of stuff, it's just important to think about. What I'm about to show you are some different funding structures of where our money comes from in this grant. So I'm basically going to go through what this award is, how to apply, and what it's all about. The goal of this particular award, and again, this is just the Fulbright Schumann, we can talk more generally about Fulbright or other scholarships if you like, is to promote mutual understanding between the EU and the United States. The reason I put this screen up here and throw these flags on there is to really emphasize that this is about the European Commission. This is about the funding that the European Commission has given me together with the U.S. State Department. So I'll even make it more dramatic by showing you euros and dollars, and to kind of stress that the European Commission in Brussels is giving money to the U.S. State Department to fund this particular funding scheme. So all of the Fulbright scholarships around the world, about 150 out there, this one is an outlier because it allows you, as, how many of you are not American citizens? I should ask that first. Where are you from if you're not from the States?
I am half Croatian and half Serbian and half overseas.
Great, sort of Croatian and Nepal and Pakistan. Great, super. Well, I'll go through a couple different scenarios. The audience that I'm targeting right now is mostly the Americans, but all of this information applies for both in and inbound and outbound. So in this case, because the Fulbright scholarship is, for instance, for the government of Pakistan, it's mostly American money being injected, to fund Pakistanis going to America and Americans going to Pakistan. In the case of Croatia, now Croatia is part of the EU, of course, and it falls under the Fulbright-Schumann scheme. In the case of Brussels, for instance, it's Belgian government money with American government money. In Sweden, it's Swedish government money with American government money. This is not one government. This is 28 governments coming together to fund this scholarship. So I can't stress this enough to kind of explain why this is going to be important in a minute when I go through what kind of projects you can have underneath this. So remember that slide. This is a really important slide. This is probably the most highest paid Fulbright grant that you will see. The equivalent of 3,000 euros in dollars a month. So that means, what is that? Is that $4,000 a month?
Yeah.
As of now, especially because the majority of you are do not have PhDs in this room, I will go ahead and tell you that all of my staff are making way less than this in a month. In a month, way less than this. And they're taxed at 50% and all this stuff. You don't have to worry about taxes. I look at everything in quadrants. So I look at the European side, so that means Europeans on the student and scholar grant, and then I look at all of you, mostly, let's say, Americans on the student and scholar side. Of this quadrant, the people who need the money the least, this kind of money, are all of you, the student Americans, because you can live for much cheaper than you would believe. I pay 700 euros a month for rent and live in a very nice place in Belgium, but this cost of living is pretty impressive if you can have this. If there was one area that I was going to cut in the future, it would be for the student American grants on this Fulbright Schumann. So until I've done that, this is a pretty impressive group to do. So again, it's 3,000 euros a month for up to 9 months of an academic year. You can go for up to 6 months if you do not have a PhD. If you do have a PhD, you could go for as little as 3 months. And then you get a one-time 2,000 euro travel allowance. We cover sickness and accident insurance. And we also, the JV says if you're not American coming over here. The two major areas, and actually this, I think almost everyone in this room will be interested to know this, is that because this is kind of an outlier Fulbright scholarship, we can kind of bend the rules in some areas. So on the left-hand side, we see scholarships for scholars and international educators. International educators means for folks like Douglas, like Larry in the room, those of you who are faculty, Sally, for instance, anybody who's working as, let's say, in the administration of UT. So, which I can talk about later if there's people who are interested in that. Scholars, to me, in my world, means you have a PhD by the time you're departing for whichever side you're going on. So if you're going to Europe, by the time you leave for Europe, you must have a PhD. That's what the scholar category is. Everybody up until then, that means PhD students, all that stuff falls under the category of students. Even if you're going to Europe to do research and not to study or to teach, you're still in my world, you're in the student category. That only is the difference because in the Fulbright world, there are two different applications. There's one for the scholar side and one for the student side. Are y'all with me so far? This is I see this. It's okay, you're good, okay. You know, in Belgium, I speak this fast, but I speak in Dutch, I speak in French, I speak in Spanish when I give these presentations, and people are kind of like, what is this girl saying? So I figured with like a Native American, largely American audience, I could speak this fast and cover more things. So basically, I would have about 25 scholarships, truncated off for Americans, whether it be in scholars or student category. And again, when I flashed that original slide talking about where the funding comes from and what we're trying to promote, we're basically trying to promote the European Union. And so what does that mean to you? Because maybe you know nothing about the EU, maybe you know nothing about, maybe you're not even part of the EU Center of Excellence here. But if you can frame it, again, how you frame your project is critical. If you can frame it into one of these categories, again, it could be outside of the scope too, but I was just trying to come up with some interesting topics for you to think about. Internal, external security, peacekeeping, trade and commerce, tourism, development, finance, agriculture. It's just, I think there's a lot of broad ways of looking at the topic of the European Union. Just by spending 5 minutes on the website and looking around at the policies and the goals of the European Union, we'll kind of see that maybe you're passionate about climate change. Well, gosh, so is the European Commission, and so is Secretary Kerry, and therefore that's a really hot topic right now. Hint, hint. So there's lots of different ways that you can kind of frame your grant and your project. Where can you go? Well, I'm focused on, I'm speaking in one way here because it's very confusing if there's international folks here, but basically if you're going to Europe, you could be going to an accredited institution, so that means one of the universities, of course. You could go to a research institution, you could go to a government office, you could go to a vocational setting, and so on and so forth. So I've seen people, for instance, a Greek woman came here last year to the United States. She worked at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And so again, not a university, but still carried out a Fulbright Schumann project. So I hope that kind of stimulates. You'll see in a moment when I flash a slide that somebody was affiliated with a library in New York City. For how long? I'd already mentioned this, but again, if you do not have a PhD, you have to go for a minimum of 6 months, and if you do have a PhD, then you can go for a minimum of 3 months. We will fund you up to basically 30,000 euros. For those of you who are international educators, we can come back to this slide, but basically you have to go to do a project. We had a really interesting woman last year from Holland who came to the University of Connecticut to do a project on handicapped and disabled scholars. So in other words, how to how to service them, how to kind of accept them. It was a really interesting project that she took back and then spread all over Europe, because I think Europe's a little bit behind in this area. The application process is kind of different. I'm skipping through some of these because it's focused mostly on the Europeans. But basically, it's the same process as Fulbright. So in other words, Larry and the team here can basically help you navigate that. And I won't spend a lot of time going through it, but basically it's a pretty significant 15-page biographical information, outlining your academic achievements and so on. There's a brand new community service, community involvement section on the student application this year, because we know that you're not human robots or students. That you have other things going on other than just your academic pursuits. Maybe you play the trombone, maybe you have helped create a charity somewhere. Those are the types of things that we also want to hear about, because we want to see that you're a good cultural ambassador, that you are an ambassador of the country that you're representing to the country that you're going to. So in other words, if you're American and you're going to Europe, that I want to know that you're a good ambassador of the United States. Obviously, maybe you're from Texas, maybe you're from California living in Texas, but that you can talk about America in the same way that we would like to see our actual U.S. ambassadors talk about. Who sits on these selection panels? So again, the process is pretty basic. If you're in the student category, you submit your application by, I think it's actually this week, right? It's October 15th, somewhere around there. What's today?
I think that's right.
Yep, so this week or next week is the application deadline for the following year for the student category. For the scholar category, it's August 1st every year. If you're in the student category, they send your application file to New York City first, which is where I'm going tomorrow to look at those preliminary applications. And then somewhere in January, they come to my office where I put together a second selection committee, made up of folks here on this screen, that we review it for a second time and we can select the final candidates. If you're in the scholar category, same thing applies, except they're sending your application to Washington, and then from Washington over to me in Europe. So this is basically the same model that you'll see in all Fulbright commissions around the world. This is basically how we work. It's this two-pronged process. One happens in the state side, and the second happens in the commission side. From there, I have in case, maybe I haven't really gone into detail about what kind of projects people are working on. I took some European files because I couldn't put together the American files, but it's basically the same kind of concept. So we had a German national who was in sociology, so again, not in one of the topics that I already flashed on the screen. He was living in Ireland, and he went to UC Berkeley, where he conducted research on migration. We had an Italian who was doing PhD work, who went to Columbia to do research on comparative study of US-EU citizenship and the right to the Free Movement of People Act. So for those of you who are not experts in the EU, the 28 EU member states basically say that you're allowed to travel and work in any of the other 28 EU member states. So in other words, this is one of the big concerns bringing in Turkey and now most recently Croatia is, will they be able to move and travel? Will they be taking up jobs in other countries? This is something that's a very hot topic in Europe at the moment. An Italian that came, this is one I just aforementioned, who went to the New York Public Library for Performing Arts to do research on cultural relationships between the US and EU in terms of dance history. So I funded a guy this year. It was really funny. The way that it works for me is that I'm given a pot of money from the US government and from the European Commission government. So I take this pot of money and I start ranking candidates. I rank them, you're maybe first place, second place, third place in the ranking order. And let's say I try to get down to as many students as possible. You're going for 9 months, you have a PhD, so you're only going for 3 months, you're going for 6 months, and so everybody's getting different funding packages. And so I try to spread my money as far down as I can, and let's say that all of a sudden, I have 25 applicants, and that, all my money is accounted for. But of course, in all Fulbright worlds and in all scholarship worlds, some people can't maybe achieve, actually go and so on, so they will cancel. And then turns out that you're ranked alternate 1, you're ranked alternate 2, alternate 3. Last summer, it was a really special summer, we had 3 or 4, or I guess 2 people who were going for 9 months canceled. So I had all this money freed up, like 60,000 euros, that all of a sudden in the middle of some jury day in August, I realized, oh my gosh, how am I gonna spend down this money? Because I have to spend it down every year. And so it turned out that the first person was busy, the second person had moved to another country, the third person had gotten a teaching job, whatever. But the fourth candidate was like, I'm ready, tell me, I'm ready to go. And it turned out he was a Hungarian. We didn't have many Hungarians on the program coming to the States who wanted to do tourism. He was like a really top big scholar in tourism. And so when I called my colleague at the European Commission, it was really funny. I was like, oh, great news. I have a Hungarian who's able to fill the spot. He's going to bring he and his wife over, to start doing the research in a few months' time. It's just so great that he was so flexible with the turnaround. And my colleague who was looking at this file was like, wait a minute, we're funding a Hungarian in the middle of January to go conduct research at Disneyland in Florida, which is essentially what I did, but of course in a very academic context, but that's true. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, in that particular case, we were trying to promote the Hungarian government to promote tourism. So how is it that the American model works? How do they kind of take that model and apply it to the country of Hungary? So that's just one other example. Some tips, which I know sounds very, very banal, but I'm going to go through them anyway, is be professional. I love people who will, after something like this, will, send me an email. Hey, Erica, listen, great presentation. I'm still on the road. As much as I want everybody to apply, all of your emails get saved into a system, and so we can actually see, and my readers can see, how professional you are to all of us. So that's just a little basic tip for any application that you're applying to. Have a clear plan. You might not actually know in this meeting. Maybe you're sitting here going, I know nothing about the EU. How am I going to do this? You'd be shocked at how many people can pull together a plan. Just call some professors. Maybe you're really interested in one particular subset. Are there any people in the non-humanities here, like hard sciences or anything? Where are you?
Mechanical engineering.
Engineering. Mechanical, you said? Mechanical engineering. So let's say you're like, mechanical engineering, how does that fit into the EU? Well, you'd be shocked. I had a chemist last year who went on the internet and found the REACH policies. Do you know anything about the REACH chemicals policy in the EU? See, just a little bit of Googling, you'll find this stuff immediately. But basically, the REACH Act is the European Commission's way of taking all pharmaceutical companies and all the 28 EU member states have to show what chemicals they use in each of their products. And so it sounds, to me, I'm not a chemist, it sounds pretty basic, right? Just like make some, translate that and put it into a thing. It's very complicated. It's been taking like literally almost 10 years for them to do it. And so we had a chemist last year who came over and was looking at the REACH Act. And he spent a semester in Brussels interviewing folks at the European Commission who were touching the chemicals policy, and then went out to do some field research in Central and Eastern Europe. That's a classic, brilliant plan where you yourself might not know anything about the EU as a mechanical engineer, but do some basic research. So having a clear plan means you might not know right now in this topic what you're looking at, but certainly by talking to your professors, by reading some scholarly articles or something like that, just by going into Google Scholar, look at some areas that you're interested in, put in EU mechanical engineering and see what comes up. Look at the universities, the writers in Europe who are sitting in what universities and what fields, and all of a sudden, bam, you realize that there's a professor at the University of Antwerp who's focused on mechanical engineering vis-a-vis da-da-da-da-da. So again, it's about the way you frame it. Follow the instructions. How often do you see students who do not read the instructions? I know that reading is not that popular as it used to be, but come on, you gotta read these instructions. So if I ask you for a 3-page CV and I hit print by accident on my computer, and this happened to me last week, that's why I'm really bitter about it. And so all of a sudden I'm like, where's the CV? It's not printing anymore. Well, the CV was 42 pages. And so my computer had run out of ink by the time that I had finished. Anyway, so what I'm saying is when I ask you for 3 pages, just show me your highlights, just show me the 3 pages that I need. There's no interview on the American side. This is geared towards the Europeans. But again, presenting the benefits of the transatlantic relationship. You might not be sitting there thinking, gosh, I know nothing about EU studies. How am I going to be talking about the transatlantic relationship? Follow the money trail. You see where this money comes from. If you know that I'm sitting in a meeting sometime in January with your file application in front of me and I'm trying to prove to my colleagues why you would be a strong candidate, you have got to help me prove to them why this is going to help benefit the transatlantic relationship. Do you get that part of it? And again, the first part is basically, show that you will be a multiplier. That is a word that we were throwing around a lot at lunch today, is how are you going to benefit, how are other people going to benefit from you being on this scholarship? So, as I was just saying, what's your name, by the way? I keep pointing at you, so Holt.
Holt.
Holt. Holt, sorry. So Holt, for instance, is doing a book. So he wants to write a book for himself. Well, obviously, if I give him a Fulbright scholarship, that's going to give him time to write this book, etc. So that means he benefits from it. And let's say you're writing on like an extremely interesting topic that only 5 people are going to read your book. So basically, your multiplier effect is you, your career, and 5 other people. So it's your job to convince me that, okay, maybe not that many people are going to read the book, but I'm going to present these conferences I've already mapped out in Europe while I'm on this grant. Here are the 5 conferences I'm going to present at with the one. Here are the workshops that I'm going to train. And gosh, you know, I'm just going to throw in there in the last paragraph that I'm willing to help you, Erica Lutes, the Executive Director of the Fulbright Commission in Brussels. If you need me to give presentations on this, you know, really obscure topic that I know about, I'm happy to do that. Just seeing that kind of involvement at the get-go is really interesting for me because I think of you as a multiplier. I think of you spreading all your information. Maybe you're a teaching assistant and you're going to come back next year, back to UT, and you're going to be teaching. Maybe you're going to have different teaching methods. You're going to change around the syllabus. That means you're affecting 150 students in, you know, World Politics 101 or whatever it is that you're teaching. This is our Fulbright Schumann website, which is brand new as of about a year and a half ago. Under here you can see, under videos, we have a brand new YouTube channel where I've interviewed a bunch of folks who have been actually on the Fulbright Schumann grant, both Americans and Europeans. And you can just kind of browse around and listen to their 3-minute clips about what they did on the grant. It's really interesting. This is the YouTube channel that I was just talking to you about. The APSIA schools, things like that. We've worked with closely with different organizations to help promote this award. Here are 4 people who are currently on the award from Europe sitting here in U.S. institutions. So in other words, if you know any of these institutions or have, you know, you're interested in counterterrorism or international relations and so on, but there are folks that you can actually look up on the internet to find out there are Europeans here in America. Maybe you want to contact them because you're thinking about applying for next year. This is that Greek woman I was telling you about who had her affiliation. She was a molecular biology and genetics. I remember when she called me in my office back in like 2011 and she told me that she wanted to apply for this grant, and I was like, what are you talking about? Like, how are you going to tell me that molecular biology and genetics falls under the EU? And sure enough, she was working on agriculture, of course, and agriculture, as maybe some of you know, is like 65% of the development funds, they call them development funds in a different way, for Europe was basically being injected into the agriculture industry. So how to, you know, like France and big countries that have massive amounts of subsidies coming for farmers, she was basically looking at. And it was just a brilliant way of combining a topic that I wouldn't have necessarily thought would have come together. So basically, I think that's what I wanted to show you and where I wanted to go with this, and kind of turn the attention back over to Larry.
Wow. That was
Was that
good.
fast? Was that a-
I want to apply. No, I just want to say a few things. I think Erica, you can tell she doesn't love her job enough, doesn't really have much energy or excitement about what she's doing. But I just want to back up a little bit and stress that I'm so happy you're here. 2 reasons. One is you're clearly aspiring to these kinds of opportunities. I can't tell you how important that is. The University of Texas at Austin has just first-class students. You go to Harvard, and the students just assume they're going to apply for the Rhodes Scholarship. They just assume they're going to be a Marshall Scholar. They just assume they're going to win the Fulbright. Our students often do not know how good they are, do not aspire for these things. Aspire for these things. It's good to think about these things. It's good to think about being a Fulbright Scholar. Good to anticipate what this is going to do for you and as well as for others. The second reason I'm excited is that I don't think there's ever been a more important time in our history that the study of other cultures is so important. We were talking at lunch, and the way I put it is, if you think of most of the world's problems right now, what do you think of? Problems in international diplomacy, what's happening in Syria, or you think of environmental degradation, whatever the problem you focus on. Most of those problems are not going to be solved by our technical knowledge. They're going to be solved by people like you, who know other cultures, you know other languages, you know the history, you know these sorts of things. Never has that kind of knowledge been more important. And where do you get that kind of knowledge? You get it from learning these languages, working abroad, studying abroad in the culture. So I'm so glad you're here, so glad you have those aspirations. Just a few things to complement what Erica was saying. I work mostly with domestic scholarship, the Truman Scholarship, and then the Rhodes and Marshall Scholars. And this is kind of a propitious time in that cycle, because last week we sent up 4 candidates for the Rhodes Scholarship and 6 for the British Marshall Scholarship. What makes a successful application? Back to Erica's point about having a plan. Do your homework. Know where you're going, want to go. Know what your aspirations are. Study who's there, with whom you might work. Again, with whom your particular expertise might complement them, and then have that multiplier effect. Have a good story. Once you've done your homework, where you have been, where you are now, where you hope to be, and how this Fulbright Schumann Fellowship will help you get to that, and how it will not only enrich your life and help you and carry out your career goals, but guess what? It's going to help others. It's going to have that multiplier effect. So doing your homework and having that good narrative.
I was just
There's
thinking
just nothing more powerful than a good narrative. Part of that has to do with, again, understanding who your audience is. So you're not just writing, for a self-indulgent kind of piece. You're thinking about that audience and thinking about how they're going to perceive that narrative, how that narrative can really be valuable, not just to you, but to a lot of other people as well. Then there's that question about, you're going to have recommendations. That's why we tell our students to get to know one faculty member well each semester, very well, so you know about their research, you know what they do, sort of thing. They become invested in you, and they can write not just, the physics department here is notorious, don't get any letters of recommendation from physicists. It's usually a one-liner, I love this student, and then a really big signature. That's it. No. You want recommenders who know you, care about you, know what your aspirations are. You've shared with them drafts of your plans, what it is that you want to do. They kind of understand where you want to go. They've got some meaty anecdotes to tell about you and this sort of thing. Maybe even that very important, increasingly important component about public service. In all of our Rhodes and Marshall applications now, we're building in, guess what, when I'm in England, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to help the people in East London do X, Y, or Z, or this sort of thing. Build in a kind of community service component too well. Having your recommenders being able to corroborate in detail what your plan is just hugely important. And I think you probably know that as well. What else do I want to stress? Do I want to stress anything else? Eric has covered so many things.
Well, I'm
hang on, don't get this. I know you're just hold on. Many eyes. I don't know about you, but when I get an application and it hasn't been proofread or it's not particularly well written or this sort of thing, goes to the bottom of it all. So do not be shy about having many eyes go over it. In fact, the more you can talk about your project to your friends, and you may lose some friends that way because they see you coming as, oh, that goddamn person wants to talk about Fulbright Schumann. But the more you can articulate your plans, this sort of thing, and get it down in clear, crystalline prose, and take real care of that, and have lots of people look at your application. Don't be shy about that. And then also, you say there's no interview on the American side. We actually do interview
Here on campus.
We have campus interviews, and that's nobody's a born interviewer. You're just not. The more interviews you can undertake, I don't care what it's for, go through the interview because you learn, and that sort of thing. And if you are in these competitions, then of course there are people on campus. For example, we'll know the last of October about whether our students will be Rhodes finalists and or Marshall finalist, or in some cases both. Well, guess what they're going to get once we get that notification?
The invitations on the interview.
Practice interviews, and maybe a lot of practice interviews, just depending on the student, because sometimes you can kind of overdo it as well, kind of overcook it. But just a last note before Erica, I know, is anxious to break in here. Again, just to reiterate, being here, having these aspirations, it is good. Are you always gonna win? No. I'm competitive as anybody, but I think I've probably since 1993 mentored hundreds of students for the Truman Scholarship, for example. Well, there've only been 19 winners in those years. I say only, that's pretty darn good. We're second among public universities in the United States in our number of Truman Scholars. But I'm often, in some ways, more invested and more proud of the students who didn't get it, because they worked so hard toward it. And guess what they have, even if they didn't get it? They've got wonderful statements of their aspirations. They've had to sit down at a very important time in their life and say, what's important to me? What do I really care about? And they've been able to articulate that. Okay. That's going to be extremely valuable when you go forward to apply for other things, graduate school and this sort of thing. And then you've got those lovely letters of recommendation. So all of the hard work you're going to put into this, I mean, we want you to win, and we know that that's what we're looking for, but it can be such a valuable process for anybody who goes through it to do that. So, Erica.
No, I was just going to throw in a couple stories to highlight the things that you had said.
Come forward.
Because
We can dance.
with everything, I mean, you said do your homework, and I put on this tip saying follow the instructions. I mean, how basic is that? Like, follow the instructions. But we had a student, I was thinking of, a story came to mind of last year when we were sitting in the selection process, and this was a fantastic project statement of an American who wanted to come to Belgium. It was in my Belgian category. And she just nailed it. I mean, she was just great in every single category. And then somewhere in the last paragraph, something caught my eye, which maybe wouldn't have caught many people's eyes, but as someone who lives in the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium and commutes every day to the French-speaking part of Belgium, she had written that she really wanted to work on her French, and that was kind of, she was kind of building blocks. She'd taken French in undergrad, and I kind of looked again at her application, looked again, and she was applying to the University of Leuven, which is like by far like the premier Dutch-speaking university. And so she hadn't done her homework, like she got it confused at the University of Leuven, like, which I could see the confusion and so on, but she didn't take the time to see that this institution sat 10 kilometers beyond the French-speaking border and was in a very important Flemish-speaking part of the country. And so that killed, for me, any advocacy work I was going to do for pushing her file forward because she didn't do her homework. It was a fantastic application, but this one one sentence killed it for me because she hadn't done the homework. In terms of letters of recommendation, I mean, it's a large institution here, but I think exactly what you just said of getting to know certain professors, it could be, your internship supervisors, it could be anybody, but developing those relationships, and not everyone's going to know how to write a letter of recommendation for you, but one of the tactics I've learned is that, formulating a one-page paper where you can, ask your professor, I just need 5 minutes at a time, 4 minutes at a time, just in between classes, I will walk you to class, listen, again, just want to remind you, I got an, A- in your class, I want to remind you that, like, what are my goals and stuff like that. I do this all the time. People constantly ask me for letters of recommendation, and when they can kind of send me a one-pager about not what to write, but just here are the things I want you to highlight, and, maybe I didn't know that an intern in my office for 9 months also was a concert pianist. I didn't know that. But when they take those 5 minutes to just explain it to me, it's easy to sit down for me to write a letter of recommendation on their behalf. I was writing a letter of recommendation this morning, thinking about that exact same thing. Anecdotes, stories. Don't just list to me all of your qualities. I am beautiful, I am wonderful, I'm excellent at sports. Like, that's great, but highlight to me why this really happened. For instance, I was in my lab last semester and a new student from China came in and I saw that she was having a rough time. I was able to integrate her, brought her into the lab and kind of made it a better experience for her. Just, concrete examples of that is really helpful. And then I think there was just one more story that I was going to jump in with, the French speaking, the letters of recommendation, helpful to apply. I mean, it's just good to apply.
Oh, absolutely.
And
No.
I think what you were saying is
Absolutely.
great because it doesn't matter if I was just giving career talks earlier this week on the East Coast, and if you are not constantly assessing your goals at different stages in your life, whether that be as a first year, as a senior, as a graduate student, as a PhD, as a post, like every single step of the way, reevaluating your personal goals. This is just a wonderful opportunity to become more introspective, and I think that word is something that you need to start off with. That you had said over lunch that an application doesn't write itself in 1 week. You need to kind of be thinking about it. We're having this conversation in October. Maybe you're kind of going to sit on the seed for a while and develop it, talk to professors, talk to your administrative staff, etc., folks that you're thinking about, and maybe this won't even happen this year. Maybe it's not a Fulbright you apply to, it's something else. Maybe, but this is, I think, how these things happen, is just by throwing, this process together. And so thinking about a project, being sincere about a project, showing you're passionate about this project, getting 3 people to certify you and say, yes, I believe in this person, their ability to do this project, I think is a wonderful, wonderful thing to have happen. So even if you don't get this particular award or another award, the fact that you've gone through this process and know a lot more about yourself and your own personal goals is critical. So I just basically,
We should take questions, you think?
absolutely.
Sure.
Point?
Yeah.
Do students
Yeah.
have any questions or faculty or anybody here? Go ahead.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about arranging a placement or getting support from an institution where you.
Great question. I get this question from Europeans a lot because they don't really know how to penetrate the American market. And one of the things that I think is nice about Americans versus the Europeans are so hierarchical. When I was an intern at the U.S. Embassy in Spain, it was very different than my internship at the U.S. Embassy in Venezuela, because the Europeans in Spain, like, interns only talk to interns, ambassadors only talk to ambassadors, and you have to know your level. But in America, of course, as an intern in Venezuela, that's a very American model, I was calling, senior representatives and things, because there isn't that hierarchy. So knowing that I just told you that European institutions are quite hierarchical, maybe will give you a different approach on how to contact folks in those institutions. In America, we do these things called cold calls, right? Like, do the little internet research. We can probably do some Google stalking and find out their telephone number in their office, and bam, pick up the phone and call somebody. I've seen cases of Europeans who call someone, a STEAM professor, and just happens to catch them at the right time, and the person's like, yeah, absolutely, come and we'll find you a carrel in the library, and we'll give you an office and even a library card, no problem. I've seen incredibly frustrated students, scholars, etc., who spend more than 6 months looking for the right advisor or person to partner with and collaborate with. Those basic tips that I explained earlier about just putting your topic into Google Scholar and reading a bunch of articles, as many as you can, and seeing the tagline down below to see what institutions they come from. That way you are doing your homework and being as prepared when you approach somebody to say, look, I know all your scholarly research, etc. Because it's so hierarchical, and depending on what your standing is, if you yourself are a professor, if you yourself are a student, knowing how to come in, do I go through the teaching assistant that I found? Do I just call the secretariat of this particular faculty at this particular institution? Maybe that conversation doesn't lead anywhere. In other words, that person's not offering you a position or a slot, but it is certainly developing one more connection. And so maybe this professor or whoever it is that you speak to will give you 2 other names. I always try to exit an interview with, thank you so much for your time, but go on to kind of call up those people and say, look, I contacted this professor at UT, and I know he suggested I contact you, pave your path that way.
If I could interrupt for a
Please,
moment,
please.
I think one of the key ways of doing it is just work with the faculty
Here.
here. That's the way that's the way it's typically done. Right? You find one faculty member, that faculty member knows your project. If they don't know somebody there, they'll know somebody who knows somebody there. They'll contact the person at UC Berkeley. They'll person will contact. It's a fairly small world, to use David Lodge's term, where you can really find the network, and there's just 6 degrees of separation at some point. And so it doesn't take much for you to find somebody who will help you connect. I get things out of the blue as a director. Most recently, somebody just asked me if they could be, they had a grant, they had the money to come over, they just need an affiliation. And part of it is, somebody on the other end is even reasonably receptive to it. But I think those are more risky. I think you're much better off just finding somebody. So if you want to go to Italy, there are a number of people here who just do Italian. Just knock on their door. You probably work with them, and then but those are really only the Fulbright grants. There are lots of grants, and this was sort of another question, which is, we've talked about the Fulbrights, we've talked about the Trumans, the others. It's how to go about researching other sorts of grants that are out there, other kinds of opportunities. And that would be too big for us to cover in any one session, but again, I think the best place to go is to your faculty.
80% of Americans who apply for Fulbright were told by a faculty member, encouraged by a faculty member to apply for it. So that's actually the #1 way that Americans usually end up applying for Fulbrights.
So I think that this is one of the many ways we should get to Europe. The roads and the marshals and all kinds of other things. But I do think that there are a plethora of ways of getting there. All of the tips that they gave you for applying pertain. They may not be as demanding a process as the Fulbright in terms of filling out application forms, but all of them will require you to have a project. And I think working with your faculty liaison and people there is just the best possible route.
Other questions or things we can answer for you? Sure.
I don't know if this, I was looking at the website, and for faculty, it says 2 different locations, so that's one question.
Yep.
And the other question is whether this location has to be an EU member, or can they be in the accession process?
That's a great question. So, so that's what I was saying in the beginning, was that this is a really special grant because you're not going to one country, really, you're going to 2. And so it makes your question about affiliation even more relevant because you have to do it twice over. And that is like sometimes an impediment for people. I think that's really like crazy to not only one country but 2 and all that stuff. Yeah, last year it was great. I guess that wasn't very clear because I had a woman who applied last year who wanted to spend one semester in Norway and the other semester in Switzerland. Does anybody know why that's funny?
Because they're not right next to each other?
Because they're not in the EU. Neither of them is in the EU. They're part of Europe, but they're not part of the EU. And I was like, So yes, you can be working on those countries, like in other words, like the Turkish accession to the European Union, but be based in Germany, which has a high population of immigrants, in Turkey, things like that. But you have to be based in 2 EU member states. So generally what we see is people do a semester in one country and a semester in another country. That's usually what we see. There is, of course, the option of doing, I don't know if you've heard of these 1-year master's degrees. They were laughing earlier about I have 3 master's degrees, but they're only 1-year master's programs. And in Belgium and Europe, I should say, that's a really popular thing. And tuition is something like less than 5,000 euros for 1 year for 2 semesters plus maybe a summer of thesis work. I mean, I can't stress to you enough how these graduate schools in Europe are a fantastic gateway because more and more they're having English programs and so on. It's a huge initiative on behalf of the European Commission. And so to that end, I think that's another possibility is doing a 1-year master's on EU studies on something related to a topic that you can frame in the transatlantic relationship, and then doing some side projects by going, to another countries, so essentially. Well, go ahead, would that answer the question, or?
And so accession, countries that have been voted into the accession process do not count?
Right,
Is
you
that-
have to be, just 28,
Okay,
28 countries what you have to choose from.
okay, thanks.
Yes, I think there was one back here first, there's sort of.
How much importance do you place on the student knowing the language?
That's a great question, one that's really relevant these days. And actually, we were just talking about language requirements at lunchtime. So I feel really torn about this question because what I want to tell you is that actually on the Fulbright Schumann website, I took down a lot of the barriers this past year because I felt like it was just scaring people. And I changed the language requirements to give preference to. And so basically, if you're going to, for instance, this University of Leuven that I was just talking about, the courses are in English, you can basically get around with only English, then obviously it's not going to be critical for you to know that language. Critical is one word. On the other hand, of course, it's critical that you know the language because you can integrate more into the country and have basically a better experience, both for you and the folks in the country. So I'm really torn about this, the way I frame this question. But what I would say to you is that if your project is basically interviewing, for instance, Turkish immigrants in Germany, then I want to see that you speak Turkish. If you're looking at Moroccan immigrants and migration and so on in Brussels, then I want to make sure that you speak French or Arabic. Those are the types of things that I'm looking for when we mentioned have a clear plan. Is that maybe we're sitting here in September, you're only applying for next year, and you've taken basic Dutch classes. That to me just shows that you made the effort, for this kind of experience. But you don't necessarily need to be fluent in the language. But just preference is given to those who have taken the time to learn the language or their topic or project. Yes, please.
So being J1 scholars, we cannot apply for this scholarship. And what about Erasmus Mundus? That's not on your list.
Yeah, so she's talking about Erasmus Mundus or Erasmus for All, which is a program together with Mary Curie grants and things like that. It's part of an exclusive European Commission funding scheme. And so this is a similar project. So Erasmus Mundus by Mary Curie and then Fulbright Schumann are 3 different projects that are all funded by the European Commission. And you ask a good question because last year I had a woman who applied for a Mary Curie grant, or no, actually it was Erasmus grant, and had a Fulbright Schumann, didn't tell me, and then showed up and she was making like $80,000 in 1 year that she had pieced together from basically European Commission money. I mean, I was like really impressed. But you can't combine those types of scholarships. In other words, it's really important. My suggestion, just like Larry's, is to apply for everything and anything. Apply for Rhodes, apply for Fulbright, apply for everything. But once you get them, make sure that you tell Fulbright, make sure you tell Erasmus Mundus, this is what I got, can I combine them? Sometimes yes and sometimes no. In this case, you can bookend the project. In other words, you can't use the same money twice, like a double jeopardy kind of thing. You can't use it twice, but you can bookend it with the project from the beginning or the project on the end, or et cetera. Where you're also still in Europe, let's say, and using it for different things. So you can't be using the same money for the exact same project from the European Commission.
Could you use it over 2 years?
Yeah, you could, for instance, the first year do a
That's what
Fulbright,
you mean by bookend.
second year do a Marie Curie. Good question. Other questions? Yes.
I don't know if this is going to relate to many foreign attendants, so if you would maybe like to address this in person, that would be okay. But for people from Europe, for non-Americans basically, studying however in the United States, myself being in that category,
Sure.
but I do want to pursue research in Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, would I still qualify for this?
So,
Would there be some
you can't be in the United States to apply, so that's one of the challenges, but maybe just knowing all these tips and so on is already helpful, but there's other funding schemes, the Marie Curie, the Erasmus Mundus, the Erasmus for All, they've expanded incredibly into letting you, as an, sort of recreation living in America and going back to Europe, that is a fantastic funding structure, so I can certainly give you those websites afterwards, or, Marie Curie, Erasmus Mundus, those are the two that I would go to, and if you have questions about it, you can send me an email, because I know I work with those folks in Brussels. But yeah, that's certainly a barrier. If you've spent time, let's say you go back to anywhere outside of the United States and you try to apply, you're gonna have to do a great job of convincing them why you, because you've already spent time in America, if you're applying as a European to come back to America, or if you're looking for research, as you just said, in Europe, then, I think those other funding procedures, Marie Curie and so on would be excellent option.
Thank you.
Well, I think we're gonna, I want to thank our public for coming, and I can't stress it enough, for both of them reiterated that it's important that you just come and learn about these sorts of opportunities and show the enthusiasm for it. I want to thank the panelists for coming and talking about both Larry and Eric. Thank you very much.